Who all here is a fan of the Dot Hack series? Anyone? Nobody? Is it going to be another one of those videos where I talk about a series or franchise that only I care about? Probably. What is Dot Hack? I can imagine some of you are asking. It's not exactly the best known JRPG series. To sum it up, Dot Hack is an ambitious multimedia franchise by CyberConnect 2, spanning anime, films, manga, light novels, and games. They're set primarily in a fictional MMORPG, which is to say, the MMO is fictional. The game itself is not an actual MMO. Yeah, that's a tad confusing to explain, I know. The big hook is typically that they're grounded in something resembling reality. The plots of both the original series, Project Dot Hack, and Dot Hack Conglomerate, which contains GU, revolve around a friend of the protagonist going into a coma due to a bug in the game killing their player character, and the protagonist setting out for a way to bring them and the other comatose victims back to consciousness. The catalyst for events varies between series, but that more or less covers the broad strokes. I'll talk about Project Dot Hack on its own at some point, but I think the biggest difference between Project Dot Hack and GU is the tone. The original Project Dot Hack has a bit more of a cyber horror vibe at times, while GU is more in line with a shonen action series. Yes, today I'm going to be looking at the Dot Hack subseries GU, particularly the HD collection released in 2017 called Dot Hack GU Last Recode, which contains all 3 volumes of the original release that came out between 2006 and 2007, Rebirth, Remnants, and Redemption, as well as a brand new Volume 4 unique to this HD collection called Recollection, which actually makes for the first Dot Hack game to get a Western release since 2007. Which, for those of you not in the know, while the last Dot Hack game released in the West was Dot Hack GU Volume 3 Redemption in 2007, there have been 2 new entries to the series that were Japan exclusive in the form of 2010's Dot Hack Link, a PSP title which is basically the greatest hits fan service entry of the series, and 2012's Dot Hack Versus, a horribly unbalanced, but flashy and amusing fighting game that was paired with the Blu-ray release of Dot Hack the movie. Suffice it to say, I'm really happy that they actually brought the Dot Hack game series back over to the West, even if it's just an HD collection with new story content. Now, for once, I'm actually going to be talking about the story in some capacity. A bit out of character for me, I realize, but with JRPGs it's kinda unavoidable. And there are elements worth talking about, not least of which is the setting. I mentioned before that the Dot Hack games are set in a fictional MMORPG, the world, already. An unusual setting that hasn't really been seen to my knowledge outside of those crappy Sword Art Online games. There's a lot of potential with the setting of an MMO, and Dot Hack games do this in some capacity. Unlike other MMORPG settings, be them shows or games, Dot Hack actually focuses on the player and their relationship with the character they play as, rather than strictly focusing on the player as the character, though there's admittedly no shortage of that. Going beyond the simple escapism the characters play the game for, some of the most standout instances for me in the series are the character Mistral from the original Dot Hack quadrilogy, Project Dot Hack, who plays an important role as your main healer through most of the first 2 entries, and ultimately retires from the world after realizing the dangers posed by the bugged enemies, not strictly because of the comatose state the players were left in when killed, but because she herself is pregnant in the real world and doesn't want to put her child at risk by continuing to play the game under those circumstances. While it's been a long time since I played the original series, that was a really powerful moment that helped ground the character as a person. Similarly, Dot Hack GU has a character named Sakubo, who is a shared account used by a sister and brother pair, known as Saku and Bo, respectively, within the world. It's an interesting concept, to be sure, but admittedly, it's kinda let down by a twist later on in the story wherein Saku, the older sister, is apparently just a split personality of Bo, and it doesn't really delve much into the psychology of having a split personality, so it seemed to me like a twist for twist's sake. It's a shame, too. A character with a shared account would have been a lot more interesting storytelling-wise. Sorry to spoil that for you, but it doesn't really have any bearing on the plot, if I'm being completely honest. Beyond unique storytelling opportunities that were sort of capitalized on. Both the original series and GU allow you to log out of the world to check and respond to emails, which can act as a catalyst for both character development and story progression, as well as a browser that allows you to check the news to see the current state of the real world outside of the world. While completely optional, this can reflect how the events of the world affect the real world, and can fill you in on how .hack's version of reality differs from our own. Along with those, you've got message boards that can fill you in on the lore, as well as rumor boards that can give you clues for in-game events and rare items. You can really tell they put a lot of love into the world building for these games, and while systems like emails at times feel like a way to make up for budget restrictions getting in the way of voiced character development, it's a welcome substitute that's preferable to having no character development at all. Now, there is one caveat if you're at all interested in playing .hack GU, and that's that I highly, highly recommend watching the 24-episode prequel anime .hack Roots. While not necessary to understand the story of GU itself, it will go ways in helping you understand the protagonist Haseo's motivations. .hack GU follows Haseo after he's set himself on the path for revenge against a player character known only as Tri-Edge who put his friend Shino in a coma. At the start of the game, Haseo finds Tri-Edge and immediately finds himself defeated and de-leveled from level 133, which he attained during the events of .hack Roots, back down to level 1, putting him in a position where he still has an undefeated and powerful nemesis to pursue, but no longer has a means of fighting him, and must come to terms with his weakness and learn how to rely on others. He finds himself wrapped up in a hunt against a rogue artificial intelligence called IDA, or Artificially Intelligent Data Anomaly, which, similar to Tri-Edge, has the capabilities of putting players into a coma in real life. But honestly, the overarching plot of .hack GU is a bit of a mess, and I can't really say it works in a compelling way on its own. IDA plays a big part of my problem with the overarching narrative. IDA is basically like the Force in Star Wars. It's a be-all, end-all answer to any weird goings-on in the world, from causing players to go into comas, data anomalies, and area restrictions, the creation of complete replicas of servers from the game to restrain players by preventing logout as long as they're in said server, but also a buff for players by giving them game-breaking powers, and apparently giving electrical and teleportation superpowers to IDA-infected players in the real world. Yes, really. Basically, if the plot needs something to happen, it uses IDA as an excuse. Thankfully, this isn't the only thing the story stands on. While IDA isn't a very effective catalyst for story progression so much as a contrived one, it does, on occasion, allow for strong character development, and helps the characters move forward. If I had to describe the focus of .hack games, and particularly GU, it's the characters in it. And while .hack GU is by no stretch a masterclass in this, in fact I'd say it's pretty far removed from good character development in most instances, it does succeed with two characters, which it makes the emotional heart of the story. Haseo and Adelie are easily the best example of character development in the GU subseries, and play off each other pretty damn well. Adelie plays a pretty big role in helping Haseo soften up from the cold and callous jackass he is at the beginning of the game, and gradually leads him towards being more open to letting others into his life, and likewise, Haseo helps Adelie to develop some self-esteem and learn to stand up for her own ideals on her own 2 feet, no longer being entirely dependent on others. These two make for a great emotional through line for the story, and I don't think GU's story would be half as enjoyable without it. If I had to complain about anything, it's that the English voice actress for Adelie leans a bit too heavily into trying to sound moe, and ends up coming across as more annoying than cute. With plot and characters out of the way, let's talk about the pacing and story structure, because it's kind of an underlying problem that plagues the entirety of the first 3 volumes. First, and most annoyingly, is that while the ability to log out of the world to check emails and message boards for character and world building is a neat one, it is unfortunately mandatory for plot progression. After pretty much every single story quest, the only way to move forward with the plot is to log out, check your emails, read the marked emails so you know what to do next, and go to it. Rinse, repeat ad nauseum till the end of Volume 3. The pacing is honestly at its best at the beginning of Volume 2 and the entirety of Volume 4, where pacing is solely determined by what happens in the world. Objectives are mentioned more organically through direct character interactions rather than impersonal emails the rest of the series likes you to check. This isn't to say that using email to move the plot forward is a bad thing by necessity. There's potential in it, but it's just overused. It makes narrative progression feel mechanical. One solution would be to integrate story progression more naturally, like early Volume 2 and Volume 4. And another option that wouldn't necessarily require complete restructuring of how they integrate story progression would be to just give the ability to access emails while logged in, rather than forcing the player to sit through multiple loading screens just to move the plot forward. Fortunately, since this is a PS2 game running on a PS4, loading screens are extraordinarily short, but it's no less annoying. Now, a lesser narrative issue that results from the games being released as a collection rather than the original spaced-out releases is the mandatory arena battles. You don't participate in just one tournament, not 2 tournaments, but 3 whole tournaments. That's 1 for each volume. And while it was enjoyable the first time, sort of, by the second go-around I found myself audibly groaning when confronted with a second tournament. In most games that would have tournaments like these, they might make you participate in one to introduce you to a side activity you can do if you enjoy it, and then move on to something else indefinitely. But nope, there are exactly 3 tournaments in .hack GU, and you're unfortunately made to participate in all of them. And much like the mandatory logouts and emails for plot progression, it just ends up feeling contrived. Overall, the story is shaky at best, thanks in part to the translation, but it succeeds well enough with its character interactions that I did find myself enjoying it in spite of itself. So much so that by the end of it all, I couldn't help but have the biggest dumb grin on my face. Long as you know what you're in for, there's a lot to enjoy. Gameplay, on the other hand, is weird. Apart from towns where you just walk and talk, the gameplay is predominantly focused on dungeon crawling and combat. Dungeon crawling is broken up into at least 3 different dungeon types. You got your fields where you complete different objectives to reach a shrine or boss at the end. You got proper dungeony dungeons where the goal is to reach the bottom. And lastly are towers, which are literally just a straight line. Or, I guess, a curve, technically. They are nothing to write home about. They're samey, uninspired, but somehow never annoying. Couldn't tell you why, either. It's certainly not environmental or enemy design diversity, since that differs by your current level and which volume you're playing more than individual dungeons. That said, I did find myself enjoying the dungeons, and I think that's at least in part thanks to the combat. Combat in .hack GU is weird. If I had to describe it, I'd say it's baby's first character action game, and the quality depends on which volume you're playing and the progress therein. Volume 1 is probably the weakest of the 3. Charge attacks are completely broken, since almost every enemy lacks super and hyper armor, which leads to a ton of chain juggling, making for easy and admittedly drawn-out fights that disincentivize the game's other systems like skill trigger and its associated counter-Rengeki system. This is, in part, due to the Rengeki only activating by consecutive hits on a single enemy, and the threshold for its activation being unusually high in Volume 1. Skill trigger isn't terribly interesting in Volume 1 either. Unless you pull off a Rengeki, it's little more than an invincible high-ish damage move that costs SP, which isn't bad, but the fact that you can just perma-juggle enemies kinda negates its usefulness. You're eventually introduced to the ability to change to another weapon class, but it doesn't really make for more interesting combat in Volume 1. At best, it makes juggling enemies easier, and at worst, it's just a different type of damage. Unfortunately, combat doesn't really gain any strategic depth until at least the early midpoint of Volume 2, at which point the combat actually becomes enjoyable. Volume 2 introduces quite a few mechanical changes. Weapon types are no longer just different flavors of damage to juggle enemies with. Enemy groups now mix in enemies with super armor that will shrug off your charge attacks, forcing you to actually maneuver around them to find openings. And certain enemies get heavy armor that reduces damage until it's broken, and take bonus damage from broadswords, which incentivizes the use of multiple weapon types. And to further encourage variety of playstyle, Volume 2 also introduces the ability to switch weapons mid-battle by using your skill trigger to map skills from different weapons to it, allowing you to exploit weaknesses long enough to break armor and switch back to something else you want to use. While the combo systems in .hack GU are overall simplistic, weapon switching goes a good way in making these fun. My only complaint would be flying enemies, which, similar to armored enemies, can only be fully damaged after hitting a certain damage threshold, but are particularly annoying because they fly, and therefore are hard to hit. An issue that goes unresolved until Volume 3, where you eventually obtain the ability to wield dual pistols. And it should go without saying why that makes dealing with flying enemies easier. The combat is simple, but fun. Yes, fun. Despite the lackluster 20 hours of Volume 1's combat, I do think Volumes 2, 3, and 4 more than make up for it. Oh, did I forget to mention Volume 4? Right, it's pretty fun. As mentioned, Volume 4 trims a lot of the fat from the original 3 volumes, and the same extends to the combat. Weapon switching is out, and now you're limited to a single weapon that has a grand total of 8 skills for the skill trigger. It's flare over depth, and you know, that's alright. Volume 4 is significantly shorter than the first 3 volumes, only being about 5 hours, so stripping away the original weapon switching in favor of flashy and stylish moves is pretty alright. And it's not completely without depth. Sure, there's no weapon switching, but every skill at your disposal has a unique weapon type damage tied to it. You've got skills geared towards armored enemies, flying enemies, and some are just for flashy damage. This is very much a rule of cool scenario. Oh, and all 4 volumes have an ability called Awakenings. They're not terribly interesting to talk about. They're basically just hit square for big damage, with admittedly flashy cutscenes that I enjoyed watching time and time again. And lastly are the Avatar battles, where the game completely uproots the basic combat system for slow, but somewhat enjoyable cinematic-ish battles that revolve around breaking through an enemy's defenses so you can finish them off with a flashy old data drain. Really, the only thing I don't like about these is how it shows a tutorial prompt at the start of every single Avatar battle, and as far as I can tell, there's no way to turn that off. Visuals are decent for the PS2 era. It's obviously got an anime aesthetic that, while it still looks pretty good, I can imagine looked better back on standard definition televisions it was built for. However, the pre-rendered cinematics of volumes 1 through 3 look better than ever. And the reason I specify the first 3 volumes is because Volume 4, while visually more impressive in that regard, has this weird stylistic approach to rendering all of the scenes at 10 frames a second. I've run it by a few people to see if they could think of any reason that might have happened, and the best we could come up with is that it is, in fact, just a stylistic decision, rather than anything to do with hardware or software limitations on part of the developers. At least that's what we'd hope. So, is .hack GU Last Recode worth getting? Well, that's difficult to say. You have to know what you're in for with .hack. It's not likely gonna be a series that'll blow you out of the water. I would go as far as to say, in terms of depth of gameplay, it's pretty mediocre. And the story of GU is a bit of a mess, really only salvaged by the surprisingly decent group of core characters, predominantly Haseo and Natalie. At best, you can expect a interesting setting that's handled in an interesting way, even if it's not used as well as it could be, and a story that, while hokey and nonsensical, when combined with the world building surrounding it, makes for a game that has a lot of heart and passion behind it. I ended up enjoying it way more than I thought I would, and I honestly couldn't tell you why. I guess the passion of the devs really got through to me. Enough to actually make me want to start from Volume 1 and play through the entire series again, but I haven't done that yet. It's a series with a lot of potential, and I really hope that Last Recode is a sign we'll see more .hack games in the future that'll make better use of the setting. Let me know if you all enjoyed the video. Your feedback is always appreciated. If nothing else, if you did enjoy the video, like, subscribe, and share it if you feel like it, and I hope this video lit a fire under you.